Hello, Lucas Lou. I have my friend here. My friend's name's David Clark, up to the Mayo footballer. And he's nice and warm and he's going to help me read you the story. Today we're reading Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Greedy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Greedy liked to eat. In fact, Mr. Greedy loved to eat, and the more he ate, the fatter he became. And the trouble was, the fatter he became, the more hungry he became. And the more hungry he became, the more he ate. And the more he ate, the fatter he became. And so it went on. There's Mr. Greedy eating. Again. Mr. Greedy lived in a house that looked rather like himself. It was a roly-poly sort of house. There's his roly-poly house. One morning, Mr. Greedy awoke rather earlier than usual. He'd been dreaming about food, as usual, and that had made him wake up feeling hungry, as usual. So Mr. Greedy got up, went downstairs and ate the most enormous breakfast. There he is, sleeping in his bed. This is what Mr. Greedy had for his breakfast. Toast, 2 slices. Cornflakes, 1 packet. Milk, 1 bottle. Sugar, 1 bowlful. Toast, again, 3 slices. Eggs, 3 boiled. Toast, 4 slices. Butter, 1 whole dish. And marmalade, 1 pot. There's his eggs. It's a lot of breakfast, isn't it? When he had finished his enormous breakfast, Mr. Greedy sat back in his chair, smiled a very satisfied smile and thought, that was a delicious breakfast. He thought to himself, now I wonder what would be nice to have for lunch. He decided in order to work up an appetite for lunch, he would go for a long walk. There's Mr. Greedy dreaming about food. Sounds like someone I know. That morning, Mr. Greedy walked and walked and walked, and then he discovered a cave. That's funny, he thought. I don't remember seeing that there before. Do you remember seeing that there before, David? No. There's Mr. Greedy, discovering the cave. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fella, decided to explore. Inside, he discovered some giant steps leading upwards. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fella, decided to climb them. They were very steep and very difficult to climb, but with much huffing and puffing, Mr. Greedy climbed up and up. There's Mr. Greedy trying to climb the stairs. At the top of the steps, Mr. Greedy came to a door. It was, without a doubt, the biggest door that Mr. Greedy had ever seen, and it wasn't quite shut. Mr. Greedy, being a curious sort of fella, decided to see what was on the other side of that door. So Mr. Greedy squeezed himself through the crack in the door, and there before him was an amazing sight. The biggest room in the world. Oh, wowzers, there's the big door. The floor was as big as a field. The table in the middle of the floor was as big as a house. And the chairs around it were as high as trees. Mr. Greedy felt very small. Then he sniffed. Coming from somewhere up on the top of that gigantic table was the most delicious foody smell that Mr. Greedy had ever smelled. There he is, there's little Mr. Greedy, and the big table and chairs. This one's a tricky one. Oh, can Auntie Katie do it? Yes, she can. Mr. Greedy sniffed again and then decided he must get up on top of that table. So he began to climb up the leg of the enormous chair. It was very difficult and it took him a long time, but eventually Mr. Greedy stood on the table. Everything was larger than life. The salt and the pepper pots were both as big as pillar boxes. Look at the giant salt and pepper boxes. There was a bowl of fruit on the table and Mr. Greedy tried to lift one of the oranges. He couldn't lift it, it's too big for him. What do you think, David? I think it's good. Oh, she's having difficulties with the pages. Are you having difficulty, Lucas? And Mr. Greedy, being Mr. Greedy, took a bite out of one of the apples there. Then he looked around. There's his bite of the apple. On the other side of the table stood the source of that delicious smell. A huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. And on the plate, huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal sausages, the size of pillows. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal potatoes, the size of beach balls. And huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal peas the size of cabbages. Mr. Greedy hurried across the table towards the plate and being Mr. Greedy, began to eat. There he is, with his giant peas, giant potatoes and giant sausages. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the plate and Mr. Greedy found himself being picked up by a giant hand and looking into the eyes of a real live giant. "And who?" thundered the giant. "Are you?" Mr. Greedy was so frightened that he could only just manage to squeak his name. "Mr. Greedy," he squeaked. The giant laughed and laughed a laugh as loud as thunder. "Greedy by name and greedy by nature," he bellowed. "Well, I think, Mr. Greedy, that you need to be taught a lesson." There's the giant's hand and there's Mr. Greedy. And what a lesson it was. The giant made Mr. Greedy eat up everything on that huge, enormous, gigantic, colossal plate. And when he had finished, Mr. Greedy felt very ill indeed, as if he would burst at any minute. "Now," said the giant in a much quieter voice, "do you promise never to be greedy again?" "Oh, yes," moaned Mr. Greedy, "I promised." There's the giant, there's Mr. Greedy. "Very well," said the giant, "then I'll let you go." Mr. Greedy climbed down from the table and went out through the door feeling very fat and extremely miserable. There's Mr. Greedy and there's the giant shoe. And do you know, from that day to this, Mr. Greedy has kept his promise. Yay! And do you know something else as well? Mr. Greedy doesn't look like he used to look like anymore. He now looks like this, which I think suits him a lot better, don't you? I don't think it's as roly-poly. So if you know anyone who is as greedy as Mr. Greedy used to be, you know what to tell him, don't you? Beware of giants. Beware of giants. Mr. Greedy.